Question 1. The analysis reveals that a financial advisor in California is working with a client who, after reading a sensationalized news article, is insistent on investing a significant portion of their savings into a single, highly speculative technology startup. The advisor has concerns that this investment may not align with the client's stated long-term retirement goals and moderate risk tolerance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor to take to uphold their professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment, including a detailed discussion of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before making any recommendation regarding the speculative investment. Option B. Recommend the investment but include a disclaimer that it is highly speculative and the client could lose all their money without a formal suitability review. Option C. Advise the client that the investment is too risky and refuse to facilitate the transaction, without further discussion or exploration of alternatives. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their explicit instruction overrides the advisor's personal concerns about suitability. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment, including a detailed discussion of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, before making any recommendation regarding the speculative investment. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where a financial advisor in California is presented with a client who expresses a strong desire to invest in a particular company based on a news report, without understanding the underlying risks or the company's financial health. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires the advisor to balance the client's immediate enthusiasm with their fiduciary duty to ensure investments are suitable and aligned with the client's financial goals and risk tolerance. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional decision-making while adhering to strict regulatory requirements designed to protect investors. The best approach involves a thorough suitability assessment. This means the advisor must engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand their financial objectives, time horizon, and risk tolerance. They must then research the proposed investment, evaluating its risks, potential returns, and how it fits within the client's overall portfolio. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the principles of investor protection mandated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the California Corporations Code. Specifically, Rule 1400 of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, which applies to advisors in California, requires that recommendations be suitable for the customer based on their investment profile. This includes considering factors like age, financial situation, investment experience, and objectives. Ethically, it upholds the advisor's duty of care and loyalty to the client. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the investment solely based on the client's expressed interest and the news report. This fails to meet the suitability requirements because it bypasses the essential step of assessing the client's individual circumstances and the investment's inherent risks. This could lead to a recommendation that is not aligned with the client's financial capacity or goals, potentially exposing them to undue losses, which is a violation of regulatory obligations. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's interest outright without any further discussion or investigation. While the advisor has a duty to ensure suitability, completely disregarding a client's expressed interest without understanding the rationale or exploring potential alternatives can damage the client relationship and may not be the most effective way to guide the client towards sound financial decisions. It fails to educate the client and build trust. A third incorrect approach would be to recommend the investment, but heavily emphasize the speculative nature without fully explaining the potential downsides or ensuring it aligns with the client's risk tolerance. While acknowledging speculation is important, failing to conduct a proper suitability analysis and ensure the investment is appropriate for the client's overall financial picture is still a regulatory and ethical failure. The professional reasoning process should involve prioritizing the client's best interests above all else. This means starting with a comprehensive understanding of the client's financial profile and objectives. Then, critically evaluating any proposed investment against these criteria, considering both potential benefits and risks. If a client expresses interest in a specific investment, the advisor's role is to act as a trusted guide, providing objective analysis and education, rather than simply facilitating the client's immediate desires. This involves a commitment to ongoing due diligence and adherence to regulatory standards, ensuring that all recommendations are suitable and in the client's long-term financial interest. Question 2. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a significant number of applicants for U.S. citizenship in California have indicated they have learning disabilities that may impact their ability to take the standard civics portion of the examination. What is the most appropriate course of action for the testing administrator to ensure compliance with U.S. citizenship requirements and principles of fairness? Option A. Offer alternative testing formats or additional time for applicants with documented learning disabilities, as per the Americans with Disabilities Act. Option B. Provide no special considerations for applicants with learning disabilities, as the citizenship test is designed to be standardized for all. Option C. Administer a separate, less comprehensive version of the civics test to applicants who declare learning disabilities. Option D. Inform applicants with learning disabilities that they must take the standard test without any modifications and encourage them to study more. The correct answer is A. Offer alternative testing formats or additional time for applicants with documented learning disabilities, as per the Americans with Disabilities Act. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the fundamental rights of citizens with the practicalities of administering a civic test. The challenge lies in ensuring that the testing process is fair, accessible, and upholds the principles of equal opportunity, while also maintaining the integrity and standardization of the examination. Misinterpreting or misapplying the principles of citizenship can lead to discriminatory practices or an inaccurate assessment of an individual's readiness for civic participation. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves providing reasonable accommodations for individuals with documented disabilities that may affect their ability to take the test under standard conditions. This aligns with the principles of equal access and non-discrimination enshrined in U.S. law, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. The ADA mandates that public entities provide reasonable accommodations to ensure that individuals with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate in their programs and services, including examinations. This approach respects the individual's right to demonstrate their knowledge without being unfairly disadvantaged by a disability, thereby upholding the spirit of citizenship and equal participation. Incorrect approaches analysis. Offering a completely different, simplified test to individuals with disabilities is problematic because it may not accurately assess the same level of civic knowledge or understanding required of other applicants, potentially creating a two-tiered system. This could be seen as discriminatory and not in line with the principle of equal assessment. Providing no accommodations whatsoever, despite a documented disability, directly violates anti-discrimination laws like the ADA and fails to uphold the principle of equal opportunity for all citizens. Suggesting that individuals with disabilities should simply try harder or study more without offering any support is dismissive of their challenges and ignores legal and ethical obligations to provide reasonable accommodations. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with administering citizenship tests should adopt a framework that prioritizes fairness, equity, and legal compliance. This involves understanding the rights of all individuals, including those with disabilities, and proactively identifying and implementing reasonable accommodations. A systematic approach would include 1. Clearly understanding the legal requirements for testing and accommodations. 2. Establishing a clear process for individuals to request accommodations. 3. Evaluating accommodation requests based on documented needs and legal mandates. And 4. Implementing approved accommodations consistently and respectfully. This ensures that the testing process is both effective in assessing knowledge and inclusive of all eligible individuals. Question 3. Implementation of accessible voting procedures in California presents a significant challenge for county election officials. Considering the requirements of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, what is the most effective and legally compliant strategy for ensuring all eligible voters, including those with disabilities, cast their ballots independently and privately? Option A. Focus primarily on voter education campaigns about existing voting methods, assuming that voters with disabilities will seek out necessary accommodations if they are available. Option B. Equip polling places with the minimum number of federally mandated accessible voting machines, but defer broader physical accessibility improvements to polling locations until future budget cycles allow. Option C. Address accessibility concerns only when specific complaints are filed by voters with disabilities, documenting each issue and implementing a fix on a case-by-case basis. Option D. Conduct regular, comprehensive accessibility audits of all polling locations. Develop a detailed plan for providing and maintaining accessible voting machines and equipment, and implement ongoing training programs for poll workers on disability etiquette and the use of accessible voting technology. The correct answer is D. Conduct regular, comprehensive accessibility audits of all polling locations. Develop a detailed plan for providing and maintaining accessible voting machines and equipment, and implement ongoing training programs for poll workers on disability etiquette and the use of accessible voting technology. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in balancing the statutory rights of individuals with the operational realities and resource constraints of a government agency. Specifically, the challenge lies in ensuring that the fundamental right to vote, a cornerstone of U.S. citizenship, is accessible to all eligible citizens, including those with disabilities, while adhering to the legal mandates of the U.S. Constitution and federal statutes like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. The agency must proactively implement measures that not only comply with the letter of the law, but also embody its spirit of inclusivity and equal participation. The best approach involves a comprehensive and proactive strategy that integrates accessibility into the core of election administration. This includes conducting thorough accessibility audits of polling places, developing and implementing a robust plan for providing accessible voting options, such as accessible voting machines and assistance for voters with disabilities, and conducting ongoing training for poll workers on disability awareness and the proper use of accessible voting equipment. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal obligations under the ADA and the Voting Rights Act to ensure equal access to the electoral process for individuals with disabilities. It is proactive, systematic, and focuses on empowering voters, thereby upholding the principles of democratic participation and civil rights. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on addressing accessibility issues on a case-by-case basis as complaints arise. This is professionally unacceptable because it is reactive rather than proactive, failing to meet the affirmative obligations imposed by federal law to ensure accessibility. Risks disenfranchising voters with disabilities who may not be aware of their rights or who face insurmountable barriers before a complaint can even be filed. Another incorrect approach would be to implement only the minimum required accessible voting machines without considering other barriers, such as physical access to polling locations or the availability of trained assistants. This fails to provide a truly equitable voting experience and falls short of the comprehensive accessibility mandated by the ADA, which requires reasonable accommodations to ensure equal opportunity. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost-saving measures over full accessibility, such as opting for less advanced or less user-friendly accessible voting technology, is also professionally unacceptable. This violates the spirit and intent of the laws designed to protect the voting rights of individuals with disabilities and can lead to discriminatory outcomes, undermining public trust in the electoral process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable federal and state laws regarding voting rights and accessibility. This should be followed by an assessment of current agency practices against these legal requirements, identifying gaps and potential challenges. The framework should then involve developing a strategic plan that prioritizes proactive measures, allocates adequate resources, and includes mechanisms for ongoing evaluation and improvement, ensuring that all eligible citizens can exercise their fundamental right to vote without undue burden. Question 4. To address the challenge of accurately identifying individuals eligible for civic participation in the United States, what is the most appropriate and legally sound method for an organization to ensure its practices align with U.S. citizenship and civil rights laws? Option A. Implement a system that prioritizes ease of identification and participation, with minimal verification of legal status. Option B. Proactively research and adhere to the U.S. Constitution and relevant federal statutes concerning citizenship and civil rights, developing educational materials based on these official legal frameworks. Option C. Develop internal policies based on historical precedents and societal norms that may influence perceptions of citizenship. Option D. Rely on common understanding and informal guidelines regarding who is considered a citizen for civic engagement purposes. Correct answer is B. Proactively research and adhere to the U.S. Constitution and relevant federal statutes concerning citizenship and civil rights, developing educational materials based on these official legal frameworks. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the fundamental rights of individuals and the legal framework governing their privacy and participation in civic life. The challenge lies in ensuring that any information gathering or dissemination is conducted ethically and legally, respecting the principles of due process and equal protection. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could be perceived as discriminatory or that infringe upon established rights. The best approach involves proactively seeking to understand and implement the requirements of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws related to citizenship and civil rights. This means engaging with official resources, consulting legal counsel if necessary, and developing educational materials that accurately reflect these legal obligations. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the supreme law of the land and ensures that any actions taken are grounded in established legal principles. It demonstrates a commitment to upholding the rights and responsibilities of citizenship as defined by the U.S. Constitution, including the principles of equality and due process, which are central to the concept of American citizenship. An incorrect approach would be to rely on anecdotal information or assumptions about citizenship requirements. This is professionally unacceptable because it risks misinterpreting or misapplying legal standards, potentially leading to discriminatory practices or the denial of rights to eligible individuals. It fails to acknowledge the importance of official legal guidance and the potential for harm caused by misinformation. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the practical aspects of identifying citizens without considering the legal and ethical underpinnings of citizenship. This is professionally unacceptable as it overlooks the fundamental rights and protections afforded to all individuals under U.S. law, regardless of their background. It prioritizes expediency over legal compliance and ethical considerations. A further incorrect approach would be to adopt a restrictive interpretation of citizenship based on historical or social biases rather than the explicit legal definitions. This is professionally unacceptable because it directly contradicts the principles of equality and due process enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. It risks perpetuating discrimination and undermining the inclusive nature of American citizenship. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the governing legal and ethical principles. This involves consulting authoritative sources, seeking expert advice when needed, and evaluating potential actions against these established standards. The process should prioritize fairness, legality, and respect for individual rights, ensuring that all decisions are defensible and aligned with the core values of the U.S. legal system. Question 5. Examination of the data shows that the preparation of practice questions for the U.S. Martin Luther King Jr. citizenship test in California requires careful consideration of historical representation. Which of the following approaches best ensures that the questions accurately reflect the complexities of the civil rights movement and the broader struggle for American citizenship? Option A. Select historical events and figures that align with a specific interpretation of American exceptionalism, emphasizing narratives of inevitable progress and downplaying periods of significant social unrest. Option B. Prioritize questions derived from popular media portrayals and anecdotal accounts of the civil rights movement to make the material more relatable and engaging for test takers. Option C. Focus questions primarily on the most widely celebrated speeches and achievements of Martin Luther King Jr., as these are the most recognizable elements of the civil rights movement. Option D. Develop questions based on a comprehensive review of primary source documents and scholarly consensus regarding the civil rights movement, ensuring a balanced portrayal of key events, figures, and the ongoing pursuit of equality. The correct answer is D. Develop questions based on a comprehensive review of primary source documents and scholarly consensus regarding the civil rights movement, ensuring a balanced portrayal of key events, figures, and the ongoing pursuit of equality. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the potential for bias and the obligation to uphold the principles of fair and equal representation, which are foundational to the U.S. concept of citizenship and democratic participation. A government official tasked with preparing materials for a citizenship test must navigate the delicate balance between providing accurate historical information and ensuring that the presentation does not inadvertently promote a skewed or incomplete understanding of American ideals. The risk lies in selecting information that, while factually correct in isolation, could be interpreted as favoring certain narratives or downplaying others, thereby undermining the inclusive spirit of citizenship. The best approach involves a comprehensive and balanced review of historical narratives, prioritizing primary source materials and scholarly consensus to ensure accuracy and impartiality. This method acknowledges the complexity of historical events and figures, including those related to the civil rights movement, and presents them in a way that reflects diverse perspectives and the ongoing struggle for equality. By grounding the content in established historical scholarship and diverse primary sources, this approach directly aligns with the ethical imperative to provide objective and unbiased educational materials that accurately reflect the historical journey towards a more inclusive American society, as envisioned by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and enshrined in the principles of American citizenship. An approach that focuses solely on the most widely recognized achievements of Martin Luther King Jr., without acknowledging the broader context of the civil rights movement and the systemic challenges it addressed, risks oversimplification. This can lead to a superficial understanding of the fight for equality and may inadvertently omit crucial aspects of the struggle, such as the contributions of other activists or the persistent inequalities that continue to require attention. Such a narrow focus fails to adequately prepare individuals for the complexities of American civic life and the ongoing evolution of its democratic ideals. Another unacceptable approach would be to selectively highlight aspects of the civil rights movement that align with a particular political agenda or interpretation of American history. This constitutes a deliberate distortion of historical facts and an ethical breach of public trust. The purpose of a citizenship test is to inform, not to indoctrinate, and any attempt to manipulate historical narratives for ideological purposes is fundamentally contrary to the principles of objective education and fair representation. Furthermore, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or popular opinion rather than established historical research is professionally unsound. While personal stories can be powerful, they are not a substitute for rigorous historical analysis. Basing test content on such foundations risks introducing inaccuracies and biases that do not reflect the consensus of historical scholarship, thereby failing to provide a reliable basis for assessing an individual's understanding of American history and civics. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy, balance, and inclusivity. This involves consulting a diverse range of reputable historical sources, seeking input from subject matter experts, and critically evaluating all potential content for bias or misrepresentation. The ultimate goal is to create materials that foster a genuine understanding of American history, its challenges, and its aspirations for all citizens. Question 6. Research into the development of a new civic education module for high school students in California has raised questions about the most appropriate method for teaching about the U.S. Constitution and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of unbiased civic education and the goals of fostering informed and engaged citizens? Option A. A module that strongly advocates for specific contemporary political policies and encourages students to adopt these viewpoints as the correct interpretation of civic duty. Option B. A curriculum that deliberately omits any discussion of historical or contemporary civic issues that might be considered controversial or sensitive to avoid potential student discomfort. Option C. A curriculum that objectively presents the historical context and foundational principles of American democracy, including the rights and responsibilities outlined in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, emphasizing critical analysis of civic processes and governmental structures. Option D. A presentation of civic education that focuses exclusively on memorizing key dates, amendments, and historical figures without exploring their significance or encouraging discussion. The correct answer is C. A curriculum that objectively presents the historical context and foundational principles of American democracy, including the rights and responsibilities outlined in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, emphasizing critical analysis of civic processes and governmental structures. Explanation: research into the implementation of civic education programs in public schools in California presents a significant professional challenge. The challenge lies in balancing the mandate to educate students about their rights and responsibilities as U.S. citizens with the need to remain neutral on partisan political issues and avoid indoctrination. Educators must carefully select materials and teaching methods that foster critical thinking and informed participation without promoting a specific political agenda, adhering strictly to the principles of the U.S. Constitution and California's educational guidelines. The most effective approach involves developing a curriculum that objectively presents the historical context and foundational principles of American democracy, including the rights and responsibilities outlined in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. This approach emphasizes critical analysis of civic processes, historical events, and governmental structures, encouraging students to form their own informed opinions. This aligns with the First Amendment's protection of free speech and the prohibition of government establishment of religion, ensuring that civic education is inclusive and respects diverse viewpoints. It also adheres to California's educational framework, which promotes civic learning that is active, engaged, and participatory. An approach that focuses heavily on advocating for specific contemporary political policies or candidates is professionally unacceptable. This would violate the principle of governmental neutrality in partisan politics and could be construed as indoctrination, undermining the educational goal of fostering independent thought. Such an approach risks alienating students with differing political views and could lead to accusations of bias, contravening the spirit of unbiased civic education. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to present civic education solely as a series of memorized facts and dates without contextualization or opportunities for discussion. While factual knowledge is important, it fails to equip students with the critical thinking skills necessary to understand and engage with complex civic issues. This method neglects the active and participatory nature of civic learning encouraged by educational standards. Finally, an approach that avoids any discussion of controversial historical or contemporary civic issues out of fear of causing discomfort is also flawed. While sensitivity is important, a comprehensive civic education requires students to grapple with the complexities and challenges of American democracy, including its historical struggles and ongoing debates. Avoiding these topics deprives students of the opportunity to develop nuanced understanding and the ability to engage constructively with differing perspectives. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes educational objectives, constitutional principles, and established pedagogical best practices. This involves consulting relevant state and federal guidelines, seeking diverse perspectives when developing curriculum, and continuously evaluating teaching methods to ensure they promote critical thinking and informed citizenship without bias. Question 7. Which approach would be most appropriate for a U.S. government official seeking to verify an individual's understanding of American civic principles and responsibilities as part of a process related to their civic engagement in the United States? Option A. Rely on publicly available social media profiles to infer the individual's level of civic understanding and commitment. Option B. Directly ask the individual probing questions about their personal political beliefs and affiliations without explaining the purpose of the inquiry. Option C. Conduct informal interviews with the individual's neighbors and acquaintances to gather anecdotal information about their civic attitudes. Option D. Utilize official government resources and establish protocols for assessing civic knowledge, ensuring all inquiries are relevant, lawful, and respectful of individual privacy. The correct answer is D. Utilize official government resources and establish protocols for assessing civic knowledge, ensuring all inquiries are relevant, lawful, and respectful of individual privacy. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the fundamental rights of individuals and the legal framework governing their interaction with government agencies. The challenge lies in discerning the appropriate level of inquiry without infringing upon protected rights or exceeding the authority granted by law. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any information sought is relevant to a legitimate governmental purpose and is obtained through lawful means. The approach that represents best professional practice involves seeking information through official channels and respecting established legal procedures. This means understanding that while the government has a right to gather information for its functions, individuals also have rights that must be upheld. Specifically, when inquiring about an individual's background for purposes related to citizenship or civic participation, the process must adhere to the established legal framework of the United States, which includes respecting privacy and due process. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of lawful government action and the protection of individual liberties enshrined in U.S. law. It ensures that inquiries are conducted in a manner that is both effective for the government's purpose and respectful of the individual's rights. An incorrect approach would be to bypass official channels and attempt to gather information through informal or potentially intrusive means. This could involve directly questioning individuals about sensitive personal details without a clear legal basis or without informing them of the purpose of the inquiry. Such an approach fails to respect the privacy rights of individuals and could violate federal laws governing the collection and use of personal information. Another incorrect approach would be to make assumptions about an individual's eligibility or background based on stereotypes or incomplete information, rather than seeking verifiable facts through appropriate means. This not only leads to inaccurate assessments, but also undermines the principles of fairness and equal treatment. A third incorrect approach would be to use the power of a governmental position to pressure individuals into providing information that is not legally required or relevant to the stated purpose of the inquiry. This constitutes an abuse of authority and is ethically and legally unacceptable. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the U.S. Constitution, relevant federal statutes, such as those governing information collection and privacy, and established agency protocols. This involves clearly defining the legitimate purpose for seeking information, identifying the legally permissible methods for obtaining it, and ensuring that all inquiries are conducted with respect for individual rights and due process. When in doubt, seeking guidance from legal counsel or supervisors is a crucial step in ensuring compliance and ethical conduct. Question 8. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict between recommending a particular mutual fund with a higher sales commission for your firm and another fund that is more aligned with a client's stated long-term retirement goals, but offers a lower commission. Considering the regulatory landscape in the United States, which course of action best upholds your professional and ethical obligations? Option A. Recommend the mutual fund that offers the lower commission to the client, explaining that this is a better choice due to lower fees, without fully disclosing the higher commission potential of the other fund. Option B. Recommend the mutual fund with the higher sales commission, emphasizing its potential for growth, without extensively detailing the alternative fund or its lower commission structure. Option C. Present both investment options to the client, detailing the risks, rewards, fees, and commission structures of each, and provide a recommendation based on the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance, even if it means recommending the lower commission fund. Option D. Recommend the mutual fund with the higher sales commission, arguing that it is a superior product for the client's retirement goals, and downplay the existence or suitability of the lower commission alternative. The correct answer is C. Present both investment options to the client, detailing the risks, rewards, fees, and commission structures of each, and provide a recommendation based on the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance, even if it means recommending the lower commission fund. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict between a financial advisor's duty to their client and their firm's business objectives. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the advisor to navigate competing interests, uphold their fiduciary responsibilities, and maintain ethical conduct within the regulatory framework of the United States. The advisor must prioritize the client's best interests above all else, even when it might impact their firm's profitability or their own compensation. The best approach involves a transparent discussion with the client about the available investment options, their associated risks and rewards, and any potential conflicts of interest. This includes clearly explaining why a particular investment, even if it offers a higher commission to the firm, may not be the most suitable for the client's specific financial goals and risk tolerance. This approach aligns with the fiduciary duty established by regulation such as the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, which mandates that investment advisors act in the best interest of their clients. It also upholds ethical standards that emphasize honesty, integrity, and putting the client's needs first. An incorrect approach would be to recommend the investment with a higher commission without fully disclosing the potential downsides or alternative, more suitable options. Failure to prioritize the client's best interests and to provide complete and accurate information violates the fiduciary duty and could lead to regulatory action, including fines and sanctions, under SEC rules. Another incorrect approach would be to steer the client away from a suitable investment solely because it offers a lower commission to the firm, thereby prioritizing the firm's profit over the client's financial well-being. This also constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and ethical misconduct. Finally, recommending an investment that is clearly unsuitable for the client's risk profile, even if it generates high commissions, is a severe ethical and regulatory violation, potentially leading to significant legal repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the client's needs and objectives. This is followed by a thorough assessment of available investment products, considering suitability, risk, and return. Any potential conflicts of interest must be identified and disclosed. The final decision should always be based on what is demonstrably in the client's best interest, supported by clear and documented reasoning, and communicated transparently to the client. Question 9. The performance metrics show a substantial increase in voter registration within a specific precinct in Florida, considering the potential for both legitimate civic engagement and subtle forms of voter suppression. What is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action for election officials to take to ensure the integrity of the registration process? Option A. Immediately flag the precinct for potential irregularities and restrict further registration activities pending an external audit, citing general concerns about voter fraud. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the registration data, cross-referencing it with known registration drive activities and demographic trends, while ensuring strict adherence to Florida statutes governing voter registration and outreach. Option C. Publicly commend the increase as a sign of heightened civic participation without further investigation, assuming all registrations are valid. Option D. Focus solely on the raw numbers, comparing the increase to historical averages and dismissing any deviations as statistical noise without examining the underlying causes. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the registration data, cross-referencing it with known registration drive activities and demographic trends, while ensuring strict adherence to Florida statutes governing voter registration and outreach. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in voter registration in a particular precinct within Florida. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires careful judgment to ensure that the increase is due to legitimate civic engagement and not due to any form of voter suppression or manipulation, which are strictly prohibited under Florida election law and federal voting rights statutes. The integrity of the electoral process is paramount, and any perceived or actual interference can undermine public trust. The best professional approach involves a thorough, unbiased investigation into the factors contributing to the registration surge. This includes reviewing the methods used by organizations or individuals involved in voter registration drives, cross-referencing registration data with demographic information to identify any anomalies, and ensuring compliance with all Florida statutes related to voter registration, such as those governing registration drives and the handling of voter information. This approach upholds the principles of fair elections and protects the rights of all eligible voters by ensuring that registration processes are transparent and lawful. An incorrect approach would be to immediately attribute the increase to external factors without verification, potentially leading to unfounded accusations or overlooking genuine issues. Another unacceptable approach is to dismiss the surge as statistically insignificant or a mere anomaly, which fails to address potential systemic problems or violations of Florida election law. Furthermore, selectively focusing on registration data without considering the broader context of voter access and potential barriers to voting would be a failure to uphold professional responsibility. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes data integrity, adherence to legal statutes, and ethical conduct. This involves a systematic review of all relevant information, consultation with legal counsel if necessary, and a commitment to transparency and fairness in the electoral process. The goal is to identify and address any irregularities while safeguarding the democratic rights of citizens. Question 10. Benchmark analysis indicates a need to assess the financial feasibility of a proposed local infrastructure improvement project in Springfield, Illinois. The project is to be funded by a special assessment levied on properties within a designated improvement district. The total assessed value of all properties within this district is $50,000,000. The proposed special assessment is an annual levy of 0.5% of each property's assessed value to be collected for a period of 10 years. What is the total estimated revenue that will be generated by this special assessment over the entire 10-year period? Option A, $25,000,000. Option B, $2,500,000. Option C, $5,000,000. Option D, $50,000,000. The correct answer is B, $2,500,000. Explanation. Benchmark analysis indicates that understanding the financial implications of civic participation is crucial for informed decision-making. This scenario presents a challenge in accurately calculating the potential financial impact of a proposed local initiative, requiring precise application of mathematical principles within a U.S. context. Difficulty lies in correctly interpreting the proposed tax structure and applying it to the relevant property values to determine the aggregate financial burden. The correct approach involves a systematic calculation of the estimated revenue generated by the proposed special assessment. This requires identifying the total assessed value of properties within the designated improvement district and then applying the proposed annual assessment rate to this total. Specifically, one would calculate the total assessed value of all properties within the district and multiply it by the proposed annual assessment rate. This provides the estimated annual revenue. To determine the total revenue over the 10-year period, this annual figure is then multiplied by 10. This method directly reflects the proposed financial mechanism and provides an accurate projection of the funds that would be raised to support the infrastructure improvements, aligning with the principles of fiscal responsibility and transparency expected in local governance. An incorrect approach would be to simply sum the individual assessment amounts for a sample of properties without considering the total assessed value of all properties in the district. This fails to account for the full scope of the initiative and would lead to an underestimation of the total revenue. Another incorrect approach would be to calculate the average assessment per property and then multiply it by the total number of properties, without accounting for variations in property values and thus their individual assessment amounts. This oversimplifies the calculation and ignores the graduated nature of property-based assessments. Finally, an approach that uses a simple percentage of the total estimated project cost without considering the specific assessment rate and the total assessed property value would be fundamentally flawed, as it bypasses the defined mechanism for revenue generation. Professionals should approach such calculations by first thoroughly understanding the proposed financial mechanism, including the basis for assessment, e.g., property value, frontage, the specific rate or formula, and the duration of the assessment. They should then identify all relevant data points, e.g., total assessed property values, number of properties, and apply the correct mathematical formulas systematically. Verification of calculations and cross-referencing with the initiative's stated financial goals are essential steps in ensuring accuracy and promoting public trust. Question 11. Benchmark analysis indicates that a financial advisor in California has a client who expresses a strong desire to liquidate a significant portion of their investment portfolio to purchase a luxury asset, despite the advisor's assessment that this action would incur substantial capital gains taxes and is not aligned with the client's stated long-term financial goals. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for this request. Explain the tax implications and potential impact on their long-term financial plan, and collaboratively explore alternative strategies that might satisfy their desire for the asset while mitigating negative financial consequences. Option B. Immediately execute the liquidation as requested by the client to honor their autonomy and avoid potential client dissatisfaction. Option C. Advise the client that the request is financially imprudent and suggest a more conservative investment strategy without further exploring the client's motivations or the specific asset they wish to acquire. Option D. Propose a complex financial instrument that could potentially defer taxes on the liquidation, without fully explaining the associated risks and complexities to the client. The correct answer is A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for this request. Explain the tax implications and potential impact on their long-term financial plan, and collaboratively explore alternative strategies that might satisfy their desire for the asset while mitigating negative financial consequences. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to actions that could be misconstrued or violate ethical guidelines, even if not explicitly illegal. The challenge lies in navigating client autonomy while upholding professional integrity and adhering to the specific regulatory framework of California. Financial advisor must exercise careful judgment to ensure they are acting in the client's best interest, as defined by both regulatory standards and ethical principles, without overstepping boundaries or making assumptions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough, documented conversation with the client to understand the underlying motivations and implications of their request. This approach prioritizes clear communication, client education, and a collaborative decision-making process. Specifically, the advisor should explain the potential risks and consequences of the proposed action, such as increased tax liabilities or potential for misinterpretation by regulatory bodies, and explore alternative strategies that achieve the client's goals more effectively and transparently. This aligns with California's regulatory framework, which emphasizes fiduciary duty, suitability, and the obligation to act in the client's best interest, requiring advisors to understand the client's objectives and risk tolerance thoroughly before recommending any course of action. Documenting this conversation is crucial for demonstrating compliance and protecting both the client and the advisor. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with the client's request without further discussion or documentation fails to meet the advisor's fiduciary duty under California law, bypasses the essential step of ensuring the client fully understands the implications of their decision and that the action is truly in their best interest, potentially exposing them to unforeseen negative consequences. Suggesting a different, more complex strategy without first understanding the client's rationale for their original request is presumptuous and undermines client autonomy. While the advisor may believe they have a better solution, failing to explore the client's perspective first is a breach of ethical practice and may not address the client's actual underlying needs or concerns. Immediately refusing the client's request without any attempt at understanding or explanation is unprofessional and can damage the client relationship. While the advisor may have concerns, a complete refusal without dialogue does not fulfill the obligation to educate and guide the client, nor does it explore if there are compliant ways to achieve the client's objectives. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and thorough information gathering. When faced with a client request that raises concerns, the first step is to seek clarification and understand the client's motivations. This is followed by educating the client about potential consequences, risks, and alternatives, always in the context of applicable regulations and ethical standards. Documentation of all discussions and decisions is paramount. If after this process, the requested action remains problematic or unethical, the professional must clearly articulate the reasons for not proceeding and explore alternative, compliant solutions. Question 12. Benchmark analysis indicates that a financial advisor in Illinois is contacted by a client requesting immediate access to specific financial documents stored on the firm's secure server. The client states it is an emergency, and their spouse needs the information urgently. The advisor has a general understanding of the client's financial situation, but is unsure of the exact protocols for releasing sensitive client data in an emergency, especially when a third party, the spouse, is involved. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while adhering to professional standards and Illinois regulations? Option A. Access the client's data and forward the requested documents to the spouse, assuming the client's urgency implies consent. Option B. Inform the client that due to the emergency, the data can only be released after a formal written request is submitted and processed through the standard channels. Option C. Contact the client's spouse directly to verify the nature of the emergency and their relationship to the client before considering data release. Option D. Immediately consult the firm's established data access and disclosure policies and review the Illinois Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA, to determine the authorized procedures for releasing client information in an emergency situation, especially when a spouse is involved. The correct answer is D. Immediately consult the firm's established data access and disclosure policies and review the Illinois Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA, to determine the authorized procedures for releasing client information in an emergency situation, especially when a spouse is involved. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the legal and ethical obligations to protect client privacy and adhere to specific state regulations regarding data access and disclosure. The urgency of the situation, coupled with the potential for significant consequences if handled improperly, necessitates careful judgment. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately consulting the firm's internal policies and relevant state laws, specifically the Illinois Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA, to understand the precise requirements for accessing and disclosing client data in such an emergency. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and client confidentiality by ensuring that any action taken is authorized and follows established protocols. It acknowledges that while the client's request is urgent, unauthorized access or disclosure could lead to severe legal repercussions and damage client trust. Incorrect approach is analysis. Accessing the client's data without first verifying the authorization protocols and legal requirements under Illinois PIPA would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This bypasses established safeguards designed to protect client information and could constitute a breach of privacy laws. Contacting the client's spouse directly to inquire about the data without explicit client consent or a clear legal basis, such as a court order or a specific exception within Illinois PIPA for emergencies, would also be a violation. This action infringes upon the client's right to privacy and could expose the firm to liability. Forwarding the data to the client's spouse based solely on the client's verbal request, without confirming the client's identity or the spouse's authorization according to firm policy and Illinois PIPA, is also professionally unacceptable. This lacks due diligence and could result in unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, identify the core issue and the urgency. Second, immediately consult relevant internal policies and applicable state laws, in this case, Illinois PIPA. Third, assess the risks and potential consequences of each possible action. Fourth, choose the course of action that best upholds legal obligations, ethical standards, and client interest, even if it requires a slight delay to ensure compliance. Finally, document all actions taken and decisions made. Question 13. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client in California who has expressed a strong interest in a particular alternative investment fund has provided the financial advisor with a prospectus. The client is eager to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in this fund, citing its high projected returns. The advisor has a professional obligation to ensure the investment is suitable and compliant with U.S. federal and state regulations. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation? Option A. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment of the alternative investment fund for the client, verifying its registration status or exemption under U.S. securities laws and relevant California state regulations, and then discuss the findings and risks with the client. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, assuming their stated interest and the prospectus are sufficient indicators of suitability and compliance. Option C. Inform the client that due to the complexity of alternative investments, it is best to decline their request and suggest they seek advice from a different type of financial professional. Option D. Recommend the client invest in the fund and advise them to consult with a securities attorney to ensure legal compliance, thereby transferring the primary responsibility for regulatory verification. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment of the alternative investment fund for the client, verifying its registration status or exemption under U.S. securities laws and relevant California state regulations, and then discuss the findings and risks with the client. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between fulfilling a client's request and upholding the ethical and legal obligations of a financial advisor. The advisor must navigate the client's desire for a specific investment strategy with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes ensuring suitability and compliance with U.S. securities regulation. The advisor's judgment is critical to avoid misrepresentation, unsuitable recommendations, and potential regulatory violations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough due diligence process to assess the suitability of the proposed investment strategy for the client's specific financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, while also verifying its compliance with all applicable U.S. federal and state securities laws. This approach prioritizes the client's well-being and adherence to regulatory mandates. Specifically, the advisor must conduct a comprehensive Know Your Customer (KIC) review, analyze the investment's risk profile against the client's capacity to bear risk, and confirm that the investment is registered or exempt from registration under the Securities Act of 1933 and compliant with state blue sky laws. This aligns with the fiduciary duty under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 and FINRA rules, which require advisors to recommend only suitable investments. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the investment solely based on the client's stated preference without independent suitability analysis would violate the fiduciary duty and potentially the anti-fraud provisions of federal securities laws. This approach ignores the advisor's responsibility to protect the client from unsuitable risks. Proceeding with the investment without verifying its registration status or exemption under U.S. securities laws could lead to the sale of unregistered securities, a serious violation of the Securities Act of 1933 and state blue sky laws, exposing both the client and the advisor to significant legal and financial repercussions. Suggesting the client seek advice from another professional solely to avoid the responsibility of due diligence is an abdication of professional duty and does not absolve the advisor of their ethical obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's profile and objectives. This is followed by rigorous research and analysis of any proposed investment, ensuring it aligns with the client's needs and meets all regulatory requirements. Transparency with the client throughout this process is paramount, explaining the rationale behind recommendations and any associated risks. When faced with a client request that raises suitability or regulatory concerns, the professional's duty is to educate the client, explore alternatives, and ultimately decline to proceed if the request cannot be fulfilled ethically and legally. Question 14. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client in California has expressed a desire to exclude individuals of a specific ethnic background from a business venture they are seeking assistance with. Given the U.S. federal legal landscape, what is the most appropriate course of action for a professional assisting this client? Option A. Proceed with the client's request as stated, assuming that private business decisions are not subject to federal anti-discrimination scrutiny. Option B. Suggest that the client use coded language or indirect methods to achieve their exclusionary goal without explicitly stating it. Option C. Advise the client that their request is likely to violate federal anti-discrimination laws and offer to help them achieve their business goals through lawful and equitable means. Option D. Refuse to assist the client entirely without explaining the legal or ethical reasons for the refusal. Correct answer is C. Advise the client that their request is likely to violate federal anti-discrimination laws and offer to help them achieve their business goals through lawful and equitable means. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to actions that could violate federal law, specifically the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of equal protection under the law. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of legal principles, ethical obligations, and the professional's role in upholding justice and fairness, rather than simply facilitating client demands. The professional must exercise careful judgment to avoid complicity in discriminatory practices. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves advising the client that their request, as stated, is likely to violate federal anti-discrimination laws, particularly those stemming from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its subsequent interpretations, which prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in various contexts, including housing and public accommodation. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct by educating the client on the legal ramifications of their request and offering to assist them in achieving their goals through lawful means. It upholds the professional's duty to act with integrity and to avoid facilitating illegal or unethical activities. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the client that they can proceed with their request as stated, without any caveats or further discussion, is professionally unacceptable. This approach ignores the potential for the client's actions to violate federal anti-discrimination laws, such as the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings. This failure to advise on legal limitations exposes both the client and the professional to legal repercussions and violates the ethical duty to uphold the law. Suggesting that the client find a way to discreetly implement their discriminatory preference, perhaps through vague language or indirect methods, is also professionally unacceptable. This approach attempts to circumvent legal prohibitions through subterfuge, which is unethical and can still lead to legal challenges if the discriminatory intent or effect can be proven. It demonstrates a willingness to engage in ethically dubious practices and undermines the principles of fairness and equal opportunity. Directly refusing to assist the client without providing any explanation or offering alternative, lawful solutions is less ideal than the correct approach. While it avoids direct complicity in illegal activity, it fails to educate the client or explore lawful avenues to meet their underlying needs, potentially damaging the professional relationship without achieving a positive outcome. It misses an opportunity to guide the client toward compliant and ethical practices. Professional reasoning. Professionals in the United States must operate within a framework that prioritizes adherence to federal laws, including constitutional guarantees of equal protection and statutory protections against discrimination. When a client's request appears to conflict with these laws, the professional's primary responsibility is to identify this conflict, clearly communicate the legal and ethical implications to the client, and offer to assist in finding lawful and ethical alternatives. This involves a proactive approach to legal and ethical compliance, rather than a passive or evasive one. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying potential legal or ethical conflicts. 2. Clearly articulating these conflicts to the client, referencing relevant U.S. federal laws. 3. Explaining the consequences of proceeding with the problematic request. 4. Offering to help the client achieve their legitimate objectives through lawful and ethical means. Question 15. Benchmark analysis indicates that a financial advisor in California is assisting a long-term client who has a history of conservative investments with a request for an immediate, large cash withdrawal from their brokerage account. The client states the funds are needed for an urgent personal matter, but provides vague details about the purpose and the source of the funds for this specific withdrawal. The advisor notes that the requested amount is significantly larger than typical withdrawals and is unusual given the client's investment profile. Under U.S. federal regulations, what is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Advise the client on how to break the withdrawal into smaller, reportable amounts to avoid triggering any reporting requirements. Option B. Immediately process the withdrawal as requested by the client to avoid inconveniencing them and potentially damaging the client relationship. Option C. Refuse the withdrawal and terminate the client relationship immediately due to the unusual nature of the request and the client's vague explanation. Option D. Conduct further due diligence to understand the client's stated purpose and the source of funds. Request supporting documentation if necessary, and if suspicions of illicit activity persist after inquiry, file a suspicious activity report, SAR, with FinCEN. Correct answer is D. Conduct further due diligence to understand the client's stated purpose and the source of funds, request supporting documentation if necessary, and if suspicions of illicit activity persist after inquiry, file a suspicious activity report, SAR, with FinCEN. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to actions that violate established legal and ethical standards. The financial advisor must navigate the client's desire for immediate liquidity with the fiduciary duty to ensure all transactions are compliant with U.S. federal securities laws and regulations, specifically those pertaining to anti-money laundering (AML) and suspicious activity reporting (SAR). The advisor's judgment is critical to avoid facilitating illicit activities while maintaining a professional relationship. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multi-step process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This approach begins with a thorough understanding of the client's stated purpose for the transaction and the source of funds. If the client's explanation for the large, immediate withdrawal is vague or raises red flags, e.g., inconsistent with their known financial profile, unusual timing, or pressure to complete the transaction quickly, the advisor must escalate their inquiry. This includes requesting further documentation to verify the legitimacy of the funds and the intended use. If after reasonable inquiry, the advisor still has suspicions that the transaction may be related to illegal activity, they must file a Suspicious Activity Report (SAR) with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, as required by the Bank Secrecy Act, BSA. This approach directly addresses the regulatory obligation to report suspicious transactions without prematurely accusing the client or violating their privacy unnecessarily. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately processing the transaction without further inquiry, simply because the client requested it. This fails to meet the advisor's fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations under the BSA to identify and report suspicious activity. Another incorrect approach is to refuse the transaction outright and terminate the relationship without conducting a proper investigation or considering the possibility of a legitimate, albeit unusual, reason for the withdrawal. This could be seen as an overreaction and potentially a failure to serve the client's legitimate needs if the funds are indeed legitimate. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to advise the client on how to structure the transaction to avoid reporting thresholds, which would constitute aiding and abetting illegal activity and a severe violation of securities laws and ethical standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a risk-based approach. First, understand the client and the nature of the transaction. Second, assess the risk of the transaction being related to illicit activity based on available information and red flags. Third, if suspicion arises, conduct further due diligence and gather more information. Fourth, if suspicion persists, fulfill reporting obligations to the relevant authorities. Finally, document all inquiries, findings, and actions taken. This systematic process ensures compliance, protects the firm, and upholds ethical standards. Question 16. System analysis indicates a need to investigate a U.S. citizen residing in California for potential involvement in activities that could compromise national security. Investigators have access to publicly available social media profiles, but lack specific evidence or probable cause to justify a warrant for more intrusive surveillance or data access. What is the most appropriate and legally sound approach for investigators to gather information in this scenario, adhering to U.S. constitutional principles? Option A. Conduct a broad, warrantless search of all publicly accessible social media profiles belonging to the individual to identify any potential indicators of concern. Option B. Initiate a formal request for a subpoena or warrant through the appropriate U.S. court system to legally obtain any necessary information after establishing probable cause. Option C. Contact the individual's employer directly to request access to their work-related communications and records based on the suspicion. Option D. Engage in discreet, prolonged online monitoring of the individual's digital footprint without any formal legal authorization, aiming to build a case over time. The correct answer is B. Initiate a formal request for a subpoena or warrant through the appropriate U.S. court system to legally obtain any necessary information after establishing probable cause. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the fundamental rights of individuals, specifically their right to privacy and due process. The pressure to quickly identify potential threats can lead to overreach and the violation of established legal and ethical boundaries. Careful judgment is required to ensure that investigative actions are both effective and lawful, respecting the principles of American citizenship. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves initiating a formal inquiry through established legal channels, such as requesting a subpoena or warrant from a court. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. By seeking judicial authorization, investigators demonstrate probable cause and ensure that any information obtained is gathered legally and ethically. This process upholds the principle of due process and respects individual privacy rights, which are cornerstones of American citizenship. Incorrect approaches analysis. Initiating a broad, warrantless search of public social media profiles without any specific suspicion of wrongdoing is professionally unacceptable. This approach violates the expectation of privacy, even in public forums, by exceeding the scope of what is reasonable and lawful without judicial oversight. It risks collecting information that is irrelevant and potentially damaging to individuals' reputations and rights, undermining the principles of due process. Contacting the individual's employer directly to request employment records based on a vague suspicion is also professionally unacceptable. This bypasses legal procedures for obtaining sensitive personal information and could constitute an invasion of privacy. It also places the employer in a difficult position, potentially violating their own privacy policies and legal obligations to their employees. Such an action lacks the necessary legal justification and could lead to legal repercussions for the investigator and the organization. Discreetly monitoring the individual's online activity for an extended period without any legal authorization or clear objective is professionally unacceptable. While seemingly less intrusive than a direct search, prolonged, unauthorized surveillance can still infringe upon privacy rights and may be considered a form of harassment or stalking, depending on the context and duration. It lacks the transparency and accountability inherent in legal investigative processes and can lead to the collection of information that is not legally admissible. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves first identifying the objective of the investigation and then determining the most appropriate and lawful means to achieve it. If the objective requires accessing private information or conducting surveillance, the framework dictates pursuing legal avenues such as obtaining warrants or subpoenas. This ensures that actions are grounded in probable cause and subject to judicial review, thereby protecting individual rights and maintaining professional integrity. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel is a critical step in navigating complex jurisdictional requirements and ethical considerations. Question 17. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client in California has expressed a desire to invest in a manner that would exclude individuals of a specific ethnic background from benefiting from the investment's proceeds, citing personal preference. Considering the legal landscape of the United States, which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for a financial advisor? Option A. Attempt to subtly guide the client towards investment options that do not explicitly exclude the targeted group, without directly mentioning the illegality of their initial request. Option B. Politely but firmly inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled as it would violate federal laws prohibiting discrimination, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution and relevant civil rights statutes. Option C. Proceed with the client's investment instructions, while advising them that their request might be considered problematic or carry certain risks. Option D. Fulfill the client's investment request without comment, assuming it is a legitimate personal investment strategy. The correct answer is B. Politely but firmly inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled as it would violate federal laws prohibiting discrimination, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution and relevant civil rights statutes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to actions that violate federal law, specifically the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause and federal civil rights statutes. A financial advisor must navigate this delicate situation by upholding their ethical obligations and legal duties, while respecting client autonomy as much as possible within legal boundaries. The advisor's judgment is critical to avoid facilitating discrimination and potential legal repercussions for themselves and their firm. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves politely but firmly informing the client that the request cannot be fulfilled because it would violate federal law. This approach directly addresses the client's request, clearly states the legal impediment, and avoids any ambiguity. It aligns with the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes protecting them from engaging in illegal activities. Furthermore, it upholds the advisor's ethical obligation to act with integrity and to comply with all applicable laws and regulations, including those prohibiting discrimination based on protected characteristics. This response prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct over accommodating a discriminatory request. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves attempting to subtly steer the client away from their discriminatory request without explicitly stating the legal prohibition. This is problematic because it fails to provide the client with clear guidance and may leave them with the impression that their request is merely undesirable rather than illegal. It also risks being perceived as disingenuous and does not adequately protect the advisor or the firm from potential complicity in discriminatory practices. Another incorrect approach is to fulfill the client's request while advising them that it might be problematic or risky. This is a significant ethical and legal failure. It implies that the advisor is aware of the illegality but is willing to proceed, thereby facilitating a violation of federal law. This action directly contravenes the advisor's duty to comply with all laws and regulations and exposes both the client and the advisor to severe legal consequences, including potential civil penalties and reputational damage. A final incorrect approach is to ignore the discriminatory nature of the request and proceed as if it were a standard investment instruction. This demonstrates a profound lack of professional judgment and a failure to recognize and address illegal and unethical client behavior. It abdicates the advisor's responsibility to uphold legal and ethical standards and could lead to the firm being associated with discriminatory practices, resulting in significant legal and reputational harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical integrity. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the legal and ethical implications of the client's request. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies and legal counsel if necessary. 3. Communicating clearly and directly with the client about any legal or ethical barriers. 4. Offering alternative, lawful solutions if appropriate, while firmly refusing to engage in any illegal activity. 5. Documenting all interactions and decisions thoroughly. Question 18. Benchmark analysis indicates that a financial advisor in California, adhering to U.S. federal securities laws and FINRA regulations, is approached by a long-term client who wishes to liquidate a significant portion of their diversified portfolio to invest in a single, highly speculative cryptocurrency. The client states they are tired of slow growth and want to get rich quick. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand their motivations. Clearly explain the substantial risks, volatility, and potential for total loss associated with the proposed investment. Present alternative strategies for achieving growth that align with their risk tolerance, and document the entire conversation and the client's final, informed decision. Option B. Immediately proceed with liquidating the portfolio and executing the cryptocurrency investment as requested by the client to satisfy their stated desire for rapid wealth accumulation. Option C. Suggest the client move their assets to another advisor who is more willing to accommodate speculative investments, as this advisor cannot fulfill such a request. Option D. Advise the client that their request is too risky and recommend they invest in a low-risk bond fund instead, without further exploration of the client's specific goals or the rationale behind their interest in cryptocurrency. Correct answer is A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand their motivations. Clearly explain the substantial risks, volatility, and potential for total loss associated with the proposed investment. Present alternative strategies for achieving growth that align with their risk tolerance, and document the entire conversation and the client's final, informed decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's stated desire and the fiduciary duty of a financial advisor to act in the client's best interest, particularly when the client's request may lead to suboptimal outcomes or expose them to undue risk. The advisor must navigate this by upholding regulatory standards while respecting client autonomy, requiring careful judgment and a thorough understanding of their obligations under U.S. federal securities law and FINRA rules. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multi-step approach that prioritizes client understanding and suitability. This begins with a thorough discussion to ascertain the client's underlying motivations and financial goals behind the request. The advisor must then clearly explain the potential risks, costs, and disadvantages of the proposed transaction, contrasting them with alternative, potentially more suitable strategies. This educational component is crucial for ensuring informed consent. If after this comprehensive discussion, the client still insists on the transaction, and it does not violate any specific regulations or firm policies, the advisor may proceed, but only after documenting the entire process, including the client's informed decision and the advisor's recommendations. This aligns with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes ensuring the client understands the implications of their decisions. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with the transaction immediately without further discussion or explanation fails to uphold the fiduciary duty. It assumes the client's request is fully informed and in their best interest, which is a dangerous assumption and a violation of the obligation to provide suitable advice. Recommending a different, more complex product without fully understanding the client's rationale or explaining the benefits and drawbacks of both options also falls short. This could be seen as steering the client towards a product that benefits the advisor more than the client, or failing to adequately address the client's stated needs. Dismissing the client's request outright without exploring their motivations or explaining the risks is also professionally unacceptable. It disregards client autonomy and may miss an opportunity to educate the client or discover a misunderstanding that could be resolved. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's objectives and risk tolerance. This is followed by an assessment of suitability, where the advisor determines if a proposed investment aligns with the client's profile. If a client's request appears unsuitable or potentially detrimental, the professional's duty is to educate the client about the risks and alternatives, ensuring informed consent. Documentation of all discussions, recommendations, and client decisions is paramount to demonstrate adherence to regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Question 19. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client in California who has expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class is seeking your advice as a registered investment advisor. The client has explicitly stated they want to proceed despite your initial concerns about the asset class's volatility and lack of transparency. Considering the regulatory framework governing investment advisors in the United States, which of the following approaches best addresses this situation? Option A. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their explicit instruction overrides any concerns you may have regarding the asset class's speculative nature. Option B. Immediately refuse to advise on the investment, citing its speculative nature, without further discussion or exploration of the client's motivations. Option C. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and overall investment objectives. Clearly explain the potential risks, rewards, and liquidity concerns associated with the proposed investment, and present suitable alternative strategies that align with their stated goals while mitigating undue risk. Option D. Recommend the investment but include a disclaimer stating that the client assumes all risks, absolving yourself of any responsibility for potential losses. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and overall investment objectives. Clearly explain the potential risks, rewards, and liquidity concerns associated with the proposed investment, and present suitable alternative strategies that align with their stated goals while mitigating undue risk. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's stated desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that outcome may not align with sound financial principles or regulatory expectations. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with U.S. federal securities laws, specifically the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, which mandates a high standard of care. The challenge lies in providing objective advice while respecting client autonomy, all within the strictures of regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, followed by a clear explanation of the potential risks and benefits associated with the proposed investment strategy. This approach prioritizes the client's overall financial well-being and aligns with the fiduciary duty under U.S. securities law. By educating the client on the implications of their request and offering suitable alternatives. The advisor upholds their obligation to provide advice that is in the client's best interest, even if it means gently steering them away from a potentially detrimental decision. This proactive and educational stance is a cornerstone of responsible investment advisory practice. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the investment without a comprehensive suitability assessment and clear disclosure of risks fails to meet the fiduciary standard required by the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. This approach prioritizes the client's immediate request over their long-term financial health and could expose both the client and the advisor to significant regulatory scrutiny and potential liability. Proceeding with the investment solely based on the client's insistence, without adequately exploring alternatives or explaining the downsides, constitutes a failure to exercise due diligence and act in the client's best interest. Another unacceptable approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their rationale or offering alternative solutions. This demonstrates a lack of client engagement and a failure to fulfill the advisory role comprehensively. Finally, pressuring the client to accept a different, more conservative strategy without fully addressing their stated goals, even if well-intentioned, can also be problematic. While the advisor has a duty to advise, an overly forceful approach can undermine client trust and autonomy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a client-centric decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated goals. This is followed by a rigorous assessment of suitability, risk, and potential outcomes, grounded in regulatory requirements. The professional then communicates these findings transparently to the client, explaining the rationale behind their recommendations and addressing any concerns. The ultimate decision should be a collaborative one, where the client, armed with complete and accurate information, makes an informed choice, with the advisor ensuring that choice, within reasonable bounds, aligns with their best interests and regulatory obligations. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that a proposed initiative in the state of Illinois to establish a new public library branch requires an estimated 15,000 new books. The average cost per book is projected to be $25. Additionally, the initiative will require the hiring of 3 full-time librarians at an annual salary of $55,000 each, and 2 part-time assistants at an hourly wage of $18 for 20 hours per week for the first year of operation. The estimated cost for shelving and furniture is $40,000, and the projected annual operating expenses, utilities, internet, etc., for the first year are $15,000 if the initiative is funded through a combination of state grants and local taxes. And the question is solely about the total initial capital outlay for the first year of operation. What is the total projected cost? Option A, $502,500. Option B, $427,500. Option C, $487,500. Option D, $462,500. The correct answer is A, $502,500. Explanation. Benchmark analysis indicates that understanding the financial implications of civic participation is crucial for informed decision-making. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires accurately calculating the potential financial impact of a proposed local initiative, demanding precision and adherence to specific financial principles. Miscalculation could lead to misinformed public opinion or flawed policy recommendations. The best approach involves a direct and accurate calculation of the total projected cost of the initiative. This method is correct because it directly addresses the financial question posed by the initiative. It requires identifying all relevant cost components, such as materials, labor, and administrative overhead, and summing them to arrive at a total projected expenditure. This aligns with fundamental accounting principles and the ethical obligation to provide transparent and accurate financial information to the public. For example, if the initiative involves building a new community park, this approach would meticulously account for the cost of land acquisition, landscaping, playground equipment, benches, lighting, and ongoing maintenance for the first year. An incorrect approach would be to only consider the direct material costs without accounting for labor or administrative expenses. This is a failure because it presents an incomplete financial picture, potentially underestimating the true cost and misleading stakeholders. Another incorrect approach would be to use a simplified percentage-based estimation without a detailed breakdown of individual cost items. This lacks the necessary rigor and transparency, failing to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the initiative's financial scope and potentially violating principles of fiscal responsibility. A third incorrect approach might involve extrapolating costs from a similar, but not identical, project in a different municipality without adjusting for local economic factors. This is flawed because it ignores the specific economic conditions and pricing structures of the relevant state or province, leading to an inaccurate projection. Professionals should employ a systematic, data-driven approach to financial projections. This involves clearly defining the scope of the initiative, identifying all potential cost drivers, gathering accurate cost data from reliable sources, and performing detailed calculations. When faced with uncertainty, it is best practice to present a range of potential costs with clearly stated assumptions, rather than providing a single, potentially misleading figure.